Welcome. It's Susan Coffin here for Attitude Magazine. I am hosting Attitude Magazine's weekly ADHD Experts webinar broadcast. Today we have a really interesting talk from Dr. Joel Nigg, one of the country's leading researchers on attention deficit disorder, and he's going to be giving us an update on what's new in the science of ADHD and the emerging discoveries about attention deficit disorder, and specifically new research that characterizes ADHD as a disorder of self-regulation. This is the first of 2 or 3 webinars from Dr. Nigg. Today he'll give us a general overview of the new science, and on September 20 he'll be back to give us more specific guidance on how to implement some of the findings that he'll be telling us about today. Dr. Nigg, thank you so much for joining us. We're always so pleased to have you.
My pleasure, thank you.
A bit of background on Dr. Nigg. Dr. Nigg obtained his BA at Harvard, his MSW at the University of Michigan, and his PhD from UC Berkeley. He's the author of over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers related to the neuropsychological, cognitive, and temperamental correlates of ADHD in children, papers on ADHD genetics and brain development. He's a professor at the Oregon Health and Science University, practicing clinical psychologist, and the author of a brand new book that we'd like to tell you about, specifically for parents of ADHD children, called Getting Ahead of ADHD, What Next Generation Science Says About ADHD and the Treatments That Work. This book was published last week by Guilford Press, hot off the presses, and you'll be hearing some of the early information that is revealed in that book. You can follow Dr. Nigg at his website, joelniggphd.com, JOELNIGGPhD.com. And if you have a question that isn't answered or a follow-up question after this webinar, post that there on that website, joelniggphd.com. A bit of housekeeping before Dr. Nigg begins his presentation. He'll take questions after the presentation, so please post them anytime in the chat box on your screen. The slide presentation is available for download now in the handout section of the control panel, and later today the webinar will be available for replay on attitudemag.com/webinar, as always. So with that, let me turn it over with great interest to Dr. Nigg, again with our thanks.
Thank you, Susan, and hello everybody. Today I'm going to give you kind of a high-level overview of what I think is really essentially a revolution in how we think about the causes of ADHD and why that's very important for what you can do in terms of optimism and hope for working with ADHD. So I'm going to start by kind of contrasting the old and new views of ADHD in terms of what it is. I think some of that will be familiar to many of you, but I want to put a fine point on that. And then I really want to emphasize this importance of our new understanding of how genetics works in relation to epigenetics. This may be new, and I'll try to get that clear here today. And then some of the new findings on the environment and why those are increasingly seen as very important in light of our new understanding of genetics. So my goal here is to give you this overview so you'll understand the new thinking. I'll hit some of the findings, but it's really the case, in my opinion, that the field has changed dramatically just in the last 5 years, and that a lot of what is out there for parents and the general public doesn't reflect that yet. So part of why I put this book out and am doing these webinars is to try to help disseminate that information. And so this is a little bit of a sneak peek at some of the arguments in the book. So the first piece that I want to get across, that many of you that are familiar with ADHD have heard about these different theories of ADHD that has kind of progressed over the last 30 years from a focus on hyperactivity, then to a focus on inattention, then to a focus on reward functioning, then to a focus on executive functioning. And those have all kind of been woven together in various theories that tried to integrate all these different seemingly difficulties that these kids and adults have struggled with. One thing that is very important here to notice is that emotion was largely an afterthought in all of those theories. And yet for those of you who are working with children with ADHD or living with it yourself, for many of you, you're well aware that managing emotions is an important part of ADHD. Children with ADHD often are very emotionally reactive, very irritable, and so on. And so that hasn't been integrated well up until now. So really these ideas weren't wrong, but they were incomplete and they weren't well integrated. And so the view that's emerging now and that I am promoting is really on integrating all this into what we now know about self-regulation as a general ability for people. This slide here of picturing self-regulation, it looks pretty complicated, but really the purpose here is to clarify for you that these different capacities to control your thoughts in terms of attention, to regulate your emotions in terms of managing how you feel in different situations, and to regulate impulsivity or action, that these are all unified or joined by underlying processes that help us engage in deliberate versus automatic responding to situations. And so this type of a picture here is a way to begin to visualize how this works in our minds and how it works in development for kids and adults in such a way that it's not surprising at all that if we can't regulate our attention, we also can't regulate our emotions very well. And it's not surprising that if we can't regulate our emotions, we can't regulate our impulses or our actions, that these are really integrated. The picture also points out that our ability to do that depends on different kinds of processes in our own minds and brains, but also on our interpersonal relationships and our social world, which is why parent-child relations and interpersonal relations come back into play here. So it's not important to know all the different reasons for all these different arrows, but just to understand that there's a close, tight integration increasingly recognized in how the brain works for self-regulation. This is a simplified version of that, just reminding us that emotion, cognition or attention, and action or impulsivity are all mutually influencing each other all the time in how we self-regulate. And that's really an important integrated view that has not been really very mainstream up until recently, even though most past theorists would not have argued with this. It just hasn't been articulated and framed this way. And it does enable therapeutic approaches and thinking about our kids to take a little bit different direction. This next slide is just a little bit of proof of that in terms of the brain. I'm not going to do a lot on the brain today, but I do just want to illustrate this, that if you look at these discoveries about how emotion is regulated in the brain, and these regions here, like up here to the left, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex down here, these are all areas that are very closely intertwined, if not identical to how we regulate our attention and our impulses and actions. So what's become clear here increasingly over the last few years in the brain imaging literature is that the brain systems and networks that are supporting our ability to regulate our attention are really closely related also to areas that regulate our emotion. What's also really important to notice in this brain picture is that these areas are widely distributed in the brain. What you see is areas up here in the cortex, but also down subcortically in the limbic system and so on. And what's very critical then for self-regulation of attention or emotion is the strength of the connections between these brain regions. These are called brain networks. And so how well these networks are working is really critical. So part of our theory now of self-regulation is it's not about one area of the brain not working, but it's about the connections among these brain areas. And that's really where the focus has gone. All right, so that's kind of the picture of ADHD that I want to have in mind as we move forward to think about what's driving the development of ADHD. And the first big piece here is to get the correct understanding of genes and environments. And this is where there has been a lot of confusion over the years, and I think even still continues today. I like to use this idea of the paradigm, and going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, the idea of a paradigm is what's the proper example or the proper illustration. An example might be if you want to teach a child how to tie their shoes, you might show them an example of a correct way to do it. That becomes the paradigm of how to do it. And so for ADHD and for mental disorders and behavioral disorders generally, there's often been this idea that it's just a genetic disease like Huntington's disease or something. We just have to find the gene. And this idea that it's just a single gene or a genetic disorder, this is really gone away in the scientific literature, but it hasn't always gone away in how people talk about ADHD. And the second piece of the paradigm that's been mistaken is the idea that it's a machine, that we are machines and they're just parts and the parts do things, and if you put in an input here or a part breaks, you just have to fix the part. Like the single causal chain. That isn't quite right either. But this type of thinking has led to an assumption about ADHD that looks something like this. And I think this really dominated much of how it was seen up until about the last 10 years. Something is wrong in the DNA, and we just have to find the gene. That causes something to be wrong in some part of the brain. We just have to find out what part. And that leads to kids not being happy and not being well adjusted and having difficulties and suffering. And this is that kind of mechanistic linear view, and it really hasn't worked very well. And what's really changed now is that the view has become much more integrated and I think more optimistic, even though it's also a little more complicated. Where did this view come from? Well, part of it came from the recognition of twin studies, that there seems to be what's called a big genetic effect on ADHD. This slide just illustrates that identical twins tend to be concordant for ADHD a lot, 2/3 of the time at least, maybe 3/4 of the time. If one identical twin has ADHD, the other one does too. Non-identical twins, that's not the case, and this big difference here was seen as evidence that there's a genetic effect. Technically, it's really evidence that there's parent-to-child transmission. This doesn't necessarily mean it's genetic. That becomes extremely important in a minute. But there's a couple of issues with this, assuming that this is telling us that it's just finding a gene. One issue is that ADHD and other psychiatric conditions do not behave like single gene disorders. Here's just a couple of obvious examples of why that is. Look at how common they are. Single gene disorders are very rare. None of them are more than 1 in 10,000 in the population. That's not the picture at all for ADHD or autism or any of these other conditions. There might be some single gene conditions embedded in here. There might be some individual kids who have a single gene condition, but that's not most of it. And the same is true when you look at risk to family members. It's a little bit more, relatively speaking, but it's a lot more when these single gene disorders. So just looking at the surface features, it doesn't seem like ADHD is a single gene disorder. A second fly in the ointment here is that we look at these twin studies. The picture is somewhat similar for infectious disease. Here I've shown you some twin data for tuberculosis in red and for leprosy in green. And what's striking here is that the picture of concordance between identical twins versus much lower concordance among non-identical twins is really pretty similar to ADHD and many other behavioral and mental conditions. And of course, there are some caveats. Identical twins spend more time together than non-identical twins, so the case of infectious disease is a little different than non-infectious conditions, but that caveat doesn't really explain these data when you dig into that literature. So what is going on here? Why do these infectious diseases look just as genetic as ADHD in twin studies? This has been the kind of mystery that's been overlooked or not well answered, and it's now beginning to be answered by a new framework for how we think about the causes of ADHD. And that idea is called epigenetics. This will be new to many of you, so I'm going to pause, take a minute here to explain it. Epigenetics is really the hot new area in some ways. It's very hard to study, although we and others are studying it. What does it mean? First of all, it's the biological tool that our bodies use to remember experiences. Literally, the body makes a physical mark on the DNA when we have an important experience. This is really a physical record, if you will, of important positive or negative experiences in our lives, including what kind of food we ate, as well as psychological experiences. It literally adjusts gene function. It's almost like turning the dial on the radio up or down on our genes. These gene marks change what the genes do. And as a result, this is how the environment affects development and affects behavior, is by change in an enduring fashion, not just in the moment, but over time, is by these permanent changes or stable changes They may be reversible, as I'll talk about in a minute, but stable changes in how the genes are regulated. And these effects, as I'll show you in a minute, can be very powerful. These effects may be bigger than the effects of just DNA sequence or what genes you inherited. Let me tell you where this takes us then is to a different model of how this works. Now what we're thinking about as far as the new models of ADHD, we still have the DNA down here. It's still doing something, but there's lots of experiences that are happening. Mother while she's pregnant, the child after he or she are born. Mother, father, and child are exposed to different environmental toxicants in our modern environment, bisphenol, BPA, lead, I'll talk about those in a moment, as well as the child after they're born. And in addition, there's important psychological inputs, stress, adversity, even trauma in some cases that may affect the parents and that may affect the child even before they're born in terms of the stress level or biological set point for the parents, but also the child's own experiences after they're born as well. These all have various physical effects. There's a lot of interest right now in hormonal effects and inflammation effects. And that is mediated by or explained by changes in epigenetics, changes in gene marks that change how genes are expressed. So what the genes do isn't determined until we know this environment and this early history. That then affects how the brain is wired and how these brain networks develop. And that's where we get the outcome for the child. And then it feeds back. This is a continuous loop of information that has some degree of flexibility in it all the way through life. And so this view, while it's more complicated, it's also much more hopeful because it means that this system is not determined like a machine, but it's very dynamic and responsive. And this recognition has led to a whole new movement in terms of looking at the environment and ADHD and realizing that the genes are really conveying only part of the story of how this works. So when we go back to infectious disease or to ADHD, what becomes obvious is that what's going on here is that the genes are conveying a liability or a vulnerability to the disease or to the disorder or to the syndrome, not the syndrome itself. Just like genes are conveying vulnerability to respond to get tuberculosis if you're exposed to the bacteria, genes are conveying a propensity or a liability to ADHD, but they're not determining for sure that you get ADHD. That is coming from something else in the environment. That's the new model and the new belief that is driving, I think, new thinking about ADHD as well as other conditions like it. Let me give you a brief just peek at the physical side of this. This diagram just illustrates how this works. You actually have the DNA here wrapped around this other tissue called histones, and there's different ways that these can be affected. When you have an important experience like getting exposed to lead or eating healthy or unhealthy food or having an emotional trauma, different changes happen physically to the DNA. A methyl molecule might be added here. It's called DNA methylation. That'll turn off a gene. Or there might be modification to a histone tail. That'll turn on a gene. These marks are turning the volume on the radio dial up and down. How much is this gene expressed? How much does that gene produce its products of protein in the system is modified dramatically at times by these epigenetic markings that are driven by experiences. And so there's a growing recognition that most of our modern conditions and afflictions are really dependent on this epigenetic processes. And again, the analogy would be if you turn the radio dial up, the volume is louder. It's the same hardware, it's the same electronics, but now it's a different volume. Or you can change a station and hear different music. It's still the same hardware, still the same electronics. And then you can turn it down again. So that's something like an analogy for how the epigenetic marks are working. And that gives us some hope then if we can figure out how to alter these marks, then we have hope for dramatically changing the condition. Now, we aren't there yet, but this is the hope, and there's increasing evidence that this is how the environmental effects work on ADHD. just as just a reiteration of that there's numerous inputs here to these epigenetic marks. Here's an example, a dramatic example from the early days in this field, just to show you how powerful these epigenetic effects can be. These two mice are genetically identical. They're a special breed of mice, but that aside, the point stands that these are genetically identical mice, and both of their mothers were given a diet that included a common toxic element called bisphenol A or BPA. Many of you have probably heard of this. It's gotten a lot of media attention in the last few years in plastics. Don't microwave your plastics and so on. Be careful of BPA bottles. You might have heard of that. And here, these mice were given this, and you can see that when the mother ate it, the offspring, these are the offspring, really had an unhealthy outcome. But when the mother also got diet supplemented with nutrients, it prevented those effects. And furthermore, those researchers showed that that was explained by these methylation changes, these epigenetic changes on the DNA of the mice. These methyl groups turned off, when they ate this diet, turned off the genes that were responding to the BPA and making this mouse sick. So it's really epigenetics that explains this powerful protective effect of this diet for these mice. And so it's not obviously caused by the DNA sequence, it's caused by the epigenetic changes, change in gene expression. This is the powerful principle that is driving our new understanding of the environment and conditions like ADHD. I'm going to turn to humans. I'm looking at food again, and just to show you that this principle can carry forward, here is just the results from a classic study done more than a decade ago now, giving omega-3 supplements to women during pregnancy and looking at the attention abilities of their infants and following them forward. And at different ages, 6 months of age, 12 months of age, and so on, the researchers were able to see that there was big differences in how well the attention developed and eventually how well mental abilities developed overall in the offspring children of these women. So this is just, and because this is a randomized experiment, this is a causal effect, just like in the previous mouse study. This is not just a correlation. This is proof that the omega-3s caused these changes in attention development in the offspring. And subsequent to that, we've had additional work showing that, a paper that we published, in fact, a couple of years ago, summarizing the entire literature here, showing that even for children after they have ADHD during their childhood, that if they get sufficient input of these long-chain fatty acids, fish oil supplements and so on, that they can experience some improvement in their ADHD symptoms. And again, those are randomized experiments, so the effect is causal. So we're seeing some hints on food that I'll come back to a little bit later that are part of the picture. Here's just another example now showing that with food additives, we also have evidence now. It's just become clear again just in the last 4 or 5 years. Controversy, I think, has been resolved that went on for 30 years about whether or not food additives like preservatives and food colorings and so on, whether those are contributing to attention problems. That literature has still got a lot of problems, but it's really becoming pretty clear that in fact they are having an effect on ADHD symptoms and attention. And here this study shows that the effect depends on the child's genetic makeup. This kind of proves the concept that the genes are giving the susceptibility, but then the environmental input is affecting how much symptoms are expressed. This is an illustration of that kind of in real data in a large study of 8-year-olds. This is several hundred 8-year-olds studied in England a few years ago. I'm turning now to environmental pollutants. The mice that I told you about were exposed to BPA. We've done a lot of work on lead, which is another common pollutant. And it's been known for a long time that lead is correlated with ADHD symptoms. That's been established for many, many years, and it becomes increasingly clear. The question has been whether it's causal. Unlike food and diet, we can't randomly assign lead exposure to children for obvious ethical reasons, but we can see if it's causal by using genetics. So here, what we did in this study is we had kids who had different genotypes for a gene called the HFE gene, hemochromatosis gene. This is a gene that affects iron metabolism. The Fe there stands for iron. And iron and lead interact in the body. And so the logic here is that nature, because nature creates a mutation of this gene randomly in the population, and that mutation changes dramatically what the body does with iron, thus what it does with lead. Because that's a random assignment by nature, nature gives us the random assignment experiment. One group of kids have a gene that creates normal iron handling, and the other group of kids are randomly assigned to a gene that doesn't. If lead is causal on ADHD, then there should be a different effect of lead on ADHD symptoms in these two groups of children. So this is kind of an elegant approach that you can use genetics when you can't do random assignment. And we saw, in fact, that's what we saw. This is just a regression line showing the strength of the correlation. The steeper the line, the stronger the association. And the bigger this number, this beta, the stronger the association of lead level in the blood with ADHD symptoms in the child. And what this diagram shows is that line is a lot steeper. The effect is a lot bigger for kids with the mutation genotype than for kids with the other genotype here. That kind of proves, or at least makes it hard to believe that it's not causal, because it's very hard to explain this pattern if the lead is not actually causal on the ADHD symptoms. The clincher here is that when you go back to the animal studies, you can see that this effect is epigenetic. So here's a recent study in rats. These poor rats were given lead in their food. The control rats didn't get any lead. This medium dose rats got a little bit of lead, about what the majority of children in the United States get exposed to every day through the air pollution and soil pollution and so on. And the rats in the high dose got a lot of lead, more than most kids would get now. And this is just a map of their movement around their cage. And what you see is more activity, random activity, excessive exploring, if you will, in the medium dose rats. Actually, it's interesting that the high dose rats are a little bit less active. I think they were probably sick. They probably just got too much lead and felt sick. But these medium dose are hyperactive. Then what the experimenters did is they sacrificed the animals and looked at epigenetic changes in their brain. And indeed, they saw dramatic changes in epigenetic, in this case, histone acetylation in the brain, and that explained these behavioral effects. So kind of confirming our story that the environmental exposure to lead is having its effect on behavior because it's changing epigenetic markings in the brain. And this will depend, as we showed in our previous slide, will depend on the initial genotype that the child has. The same story holds for stress and adversity. Here's just a detailed diagram. A lot is known at this point about the biology of stress, trauma, adversity in animals, and increasingly it's becoming clear the same picture holds in humans. I'm not going to go into the details here, but just to reassure you that there's a pretty good biological understanding here. It involves epigenetic changes. And the part I want to highlight here is the reversibility of this. So these stressful effects do things to brain development, but can they be reversed or overcome? Here we have a slide of showing that exercise can do a lot to change the brain. And in our next webinar in September, we'll say a lot more about exercise. But exercise is a tremendous therapy for the brain, for attention, and for development of the parts of the brain that help self-regulation. This is just a brain imaging slide showing how much more active and integrated the brain is after in people who exercise regularly than in individuals who don't exercise regularly in a random assigned experiment. This should be correlated with more alertness and so on. If exercise is this beneficial, what does it do to the brain changes in stress? Well, the exciting news here comes from now, this is a recent last year animal study, although there's now been a handful of these studies showing this effect, that these effects are reversible. So what has happened in this study, if we'll walk through, and let's just focus on the right-hand side here, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's so important for self-regulation. We see here is the animals who were just given a normal rearing environment. And these animals early in life were given a substantial stressor. What they do to the animals is they restrain the rat in a restraint for a period of time each day. And for the rats, that's extraordinarily stressful. It would be for anyone probably, but certainly for the rats, it's very, very stressful. And those rats then experience epigenetic changes. This global methylation here just shows that the cortex sees substantial methylation. A lot of genes are getting turned off, and that's affecting the rat's functioning, just as it does in other experiments where we see that stress makes changes in the brain that affect health and outcome. When the third group of rats were given the stress, but they were also given lots of exercise. And what's remarkable here is that the exercise completely wiped out these stress effects on the brain. If anything, in fact, their brains are even more high functioning than the normal brains. And so the idea here that stress can reverse the epigenetic, that exercise can reverse these epigenetic effects is the first really good example demonstrated in animals that just direct reversal of harmful epigenetic effects from a negative early experience. It opens up a door for really thinking about how we can use lifestyle changes to overcome some of the other prior experiences that a child may have had, whether those are chemical or dietary or others that are still to be discovered that have activated their ADHD potential, and whether that can be reversed by new ideas about how to use previous ideas that were not maybe taken seriously enough. All right, so kind of to summarize then, what we're seeing is that ADHD is not necessarily best understood as a genetic condition, but rather as a condition that has a genetic liability to it, combined with environmental amplification or buffering of that. We don't know everything about how that works, but we're beginning to get some pretty powerful clues that there are early life developmental changes, but then it can also be modulated over time to a degree that we're still discovering. And that these appear to be explained by or mediated by epigenetic changes in the body that may be reversible in many instances, giving us new hope for potentially dramatic treatment breakthroughs in the future. But at the immediate moment, new motivation to really get more serious about our environmental interventions for ADHD. How big are these effects? I want to clarify for you that these effects vary in their power, so I do not want to create a false panacea here. Some of these effects are pretty modest and pretty small, and if you use these interventions, you won't necessarily see a total cure of ADHD by any means, and yet at the same time, we're beginning to see that these effects are real. So let me give you some perspective here. We're using an effect size metric here called D. It's not terribly important what that means. This is the relative effects I want to show you, but I've got a little diagram here giving you an illustration of overlapping populations when the D is 0.7. But let me give you some perspective on this. So here's the effect of TV and video watching. We know that TV and video does cause some weakening of attention and some slight increase in ADHD symptoms, but the effect size is quite small. This is not enough that you would probably notice it in everyday life. It's only 0.1. So it might be important at an epidemiological level or at a public policy level, but it's not something that if you cut out TV, you might get some benefit, but it probably is going to be pretty subtle. On the other hand, omega-3 supplementation has a little bit twice as big of an effect. It's 0.2, still modest, but this is enough that you might notice it in real life. And the effect is similar for food additives and how they cause ADHD symptoms to get worse. To give perspective here, this is about the difference in girls' height from age 15 to 16. So 1 year of growth on average, that's about the difference we're seeing here in terms of the size of these effects. That gives you a perspective on the size of that effect. On average now, individuals might have bigger effects and some individuals might have smaller effects due to their genetic makeup, like I showed you before about food and lead, but this is the average effect. For lead, the effect is a little bit bigger still. That's an effect similar to the association between secondhand smoke and getting cancer. So again, that's a great public health significance. It's big enough you'd want to know about it, even though the effect may seem small by some comparisons. Watching violent video and TV games causes children to be more aggressive. That's well established. That effect is about 0.5. So that's starting to be an effect that you can really notice in real life pretty visible and pretty noticeable, and a very large effect on the population as a whole. We then look at aerobic exercise. There's not as much literature on this, but a recent survey suggests that the effect is pretty big, about 0.6. Now we're getting up to the difference in height of girls between age 14 and 18 years of age. So that's a pretty noticeable difference, and something that, again, should be, when it works, should be noticeable if we can get the right combination here of intervention. So this is a promising effect. Smoking and lung cancer, just a little bit bigger than that. So again, that shows you where we're getting into pretty important areas here, pretty important associations from a public health perspective. Not quite as big yet as the ADHD medication effect, which can be quite dramatic on average, but nonetheless important. And the critical question that we don't know yet, and I think where I'm eager to see this field go, is when you do all these things together. We talk about this in the book. Each of these things does a little bit. If you do all of them together, how big of an effect can you get? We don't really know, and this is where creating some lifestyle plans for families who are able to do that and interested in doing it is going to be something worth looking at more closely. And again, this medication effect is easy to see on average. So we'll do more detail on this at the next webinar. Here's a quick summary of some things that we cover in the book as far as practical steps. We have pretty strong evidence now, really convincing evidence, that exercise is very beneficial for child development and for attention, and probably for ADHD as well. Sleep is a big issue that we didn't talk about here, but has important effects for learning, and it's a concern for many, many people with ADHD. I mentioned briefly that we now have clear findings for a couple of key aspects about diet, and more are probably on the way. We're getting more knowledge now about the benefits and the harms of different kinds of technology. There are new technological treatments that we can talk about, as well as, although they're controversial and not yet proven, as well as newly understood benefits and risks of various kinds of technology use. A very complex area, but very important. Stress and adversity, probably not emphasized enough for many people with ADHD. ADHD obviously can contribute to stress for the family and create some kind of a cycle of stress there. And then for all of these matters, there are effects on parents, many of you, as well as on the child, and these interplay with each other in ways that become complex, but also give us toeholds and handholds for how to make change. All right, so to wrap this up, ADHD is increasingly, I think, now seen as involving an integrated development of self-regulation. Attention, emotion, and impulse all go together. It now makes sense, and we kind of are seeing the brain systems. The causes now are not simply genetic, but rather genetic liability modified by environmental elements that we are now just starting to understand. That because of our knowledge of epigenetics, the environment has revived. I'm calling this the decade of the environment for ADHD. Interest in the environment is really growing rapidly, and studies are exploding on all sides on this, so we get new knowledge coming in. And many of these findings are already actionable. Even when the findings are preliminary, they're often actionable, and in other areas we're getting better discrimination of which changes in lifestyle may be helpful and which maybe aren't actually that helpful. And again, we will develop this as we go forward in future webinars, but this, I hope, will give you some idea and some excitement that there's a lot of possibilities here. And of course, I've just finished writing a whole lot about this. You're welcome to take a look at this and at the website. And I was told by Guilford today that if you are a webinar attendee, you can get a 20% discount by putting code 2E at the web page. So a little marketing plug there. All right, thank you very much. And I think we're ready for Susan to take it back to questions.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I mean, there's lots of excitement among the listeners who are posting things like, I'm so optimistic. This gives me so much hope and excitement. So this is great news, I think. Some specific questions here from the lay people who are listening in. Are we saying that the epigenetics themselves are changed by these positive impact, by these positive influences such as diet, exercise, and so forth?
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. The epigenetic markings actually are added or removed by some of these experiences, and we know that from animals that happens both adding and removing. What we don't know is how much and how greatly that can be done, but we know it can happen.
Great. So then what the breakthrough is that genes themselves can probably not be changed easily, but these epigenetic connectors can be affected both positively and negatively. I think is what we're saying.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. We're not going to try to. We're decades away from trying to edit the genome, but right now we can change the epigenetic marks.
That's really fascinating. So a couple of questions. Is there one person asked something interesting? He says as an adult with ADHD, what's the single most important thing that he could do in your view?
If I could pick only one, not knowing your specific situation because everybody's profile is different, I'd probably say exercise.
Exercise, yeah.
Frequent, regular aerobic exercise seems to be the most well-established benefit for the brain and for self-regulation of all these things. If that's hard for you to do for some reason, I would then move to stress management, really get focused on managing your stress level. And then from there, I would move, the third level would be the dietary changes. Some of those are easy and some of those are hard. Right.
So mindfulness, there's a post here that says, so what this means is that mindfulness is important. Is that an accurate deduction? I'm not sure it is.
Yeah,
I guess in stress management it might be, yeah.
In stress management, mindfulness is interesting. Stress management is really the guts of it there. Mindfulness may be a tool for doing that. The research on mindfulness and ADHD is an interesting whole area. For as far as I can tell from that literature, having children do mindfulness stuff by themselves doesn't do much for kids with ADHD. It might for adults, but not for kids. However, when parents do mindfulness stuff with their kids, then we see benefits. So it seems like the real key here is for the family dynamic and the parent-child dynamic to get a little more low-key and a little more mellow, and that seems to really help the kids. And the mindfulness can be a tool there.
The stress level and the whole family being dialed down.
Exactly. I think one of the pieces here is ADHD is kind of can be thought of as an extra sensitivity to everything around them, and so whatever might be mildly stressful to a non-ADHD person might be much more so for an ADHD person.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so in the sense of it being extreme deregulation and dysregulation. Okay, so another question that's come up here, both for adults and for children, is it worth testing for lead, for dietary, for other things that might be going on in a child or an adult?
I think it is. Now, this is not standard of care, so the standard of care would still say that you ordinarily would not do this. So if your clinician doesn't want to do it, they're only following their own standard of care. But my own opinion is, if for my own situation, my own children, if I'm in this situation, I would go ahead and check it for a couple of reasons. One is that with lead, we now know that even a little bit of exposure seems to be correlated if the child is genetically vulnerable, but we can't prove the genetic vulnerability, so all we can do is assume they're vulnerable if they have ADHD. And you often can remove the lead from your own environment just by filtering your water, cleaning up the old paint around your house, maybe testing the soil. It's often possible. Typically, it's either air pollution or lead from the pipes in the water or from the soil, so it's often manageable if you want to reduce it with a little bit of work. And then on diet, we do know that there are some kids with ADHD who have low levels of omega-3s in their blood or low levels of other nutrients. Then you have a direct target if that's there. So it's always worth checking that. But you can do these dietary supplemental things even without any blood tests. You can just go ahead and try some of these things and you may see benefits depending on what's in it.
I know one of our advisors, Sandy Newmark, Dr. Newmark, advises that all parents of children with ADHD have them tested for iron, zinc, lead. He's a firm believer and has been so for some years, so perhaps.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised if that's where we go in the next 5-10 years as more and more people start to see this.
Really fascinating. There's concerns about fish oil. There's a concern that they may have heavy metal contamination because of commercial fishing. Should people be concerned about fish oil contamination?
Yes, it's a very, very important concern, and it's kind of a mixed bag. the best way to get a fish oil is to eat fish, but as the listener points out, you might also be taking in pollutants and contaminants. It seems like there's and that's a true effect. So in the studies of heavy fish eaters, there are actually studies of people who eat a lot of fish in coastal communities, and these show both that the fish omega-3 is associated with benefits, but also that the contaminants in the fish are associated with harms. And so what's the net balance? So it's worth shopping for your fish in such a way that you typically the ocean-going fish may not be as polluted as the freshwater fish, depending on where you're getting the fish. And sometimes the fish oils in the health food stores are purified of these elements, or claim they are. It's hard to verify those claims, however. So it's a valid concern, but on net value, I think it's probably still, with a little bit of caution, take your best effort at it. It's still worth, I think, eating the fish and the fish oil, and just being somewhat careful about that.
But paying attention to the sources of the fish and
best you can,
yeah, as best you can, right? It's an interesting question here about the impact of ADHD medications. Specifically, the listener is asking, does ADHD medication impact epigenetics? Is there any way to repair the epigenetics that through medication?
It's a great question, and we don't know. We are just in the process now of looking at the correlation in our own large cohort between whether they take medication and epigenetic changes. We're looking at those data now. Hope to have results on that within a year or so as we finish going through this study. But that won't be a causal test. That'll just be a correlation test. There hasn't been a pre and post study done yet to look at what happens epigenetically with medication, and whether that in fact is working via, when it does work, working via epigenetic changes. Probably it is, but that hasn't been demonstrated.
Interesting. Yeah, we don't know. We don't know very much about medication and why it works as it does.
Right. But it'd be logical to think it is. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, it would. There are a number of questions about different ADHD treatments. So here's one about neurofeedback, which I think many parents struggle with. Neurofeedback. Is it something that can really make a difference or not? What's your view on its impact on epigenetics, I guess?
I'm in the skeptical group on neurofeedback at this point.
Okay.
There is certainly some very intriguing studies on neurofeedback, but the arm's length reviews that I have seen by researchers who are not invested in whether it works or not tend to conclude that it's not convincing. And so something is still going on there that we haven't determined about why some studies look so good on that. Given how expensive it is, and the effort, I would say if you're going to put that much money and effort in, I would rather see your child get a lot of great exercise and a really great diet before I would spend the money on neurofeedback, given that the evidence is so much more clear. Right.
The evidence is just so mixed on neurofeedback, and it seems to make such a difference as to who the neurofeedback practitioner is and a number of other factors. So
that's the concern I still have. Exactly.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question from a mother who says, I had lead poisoning myself as a child. Could that be the reason for my child's severe ADHD? Wow.
That's a really interesting question. I'd be speculating there. I mean, it's conceivable. Right. It's conceivable one could make a story up there that your lead exposure created epigenetic changes in you, that in turn was transferred onto your child. There is some evidence that some of these things can be inherited, which is one of the other kind of dramatic discoveries, although that's still some controversy. So it's conceivable, yes. And the best way to look at that, though, would be to look at your own child's lead level. You probably already have, given your knowledge of this, it sounds like, from this particular listener. There are dietary remedies that is beginning to be looked into, increasing iron intake, possibly zinc intake. This would be a question for your knowledgeable physician or Dr. Newmark, but there is some evidence that you can compensate for some of the lead damage by dietary interventions. We don't know how long that works for or when in development, but it's conceivable. I'd be speculating, though, if I said I knew that.
Okay, that sounds realistic. A number of questions about cognitive change, cognitive behavior therapy, coaching. other sorts of cognitive skills training? How are they affecting epigenetics? Where do they fit into the treatment?
Yeah, it's a great
options?
question. It's a great question. The literature on coaching now has really started to finally get traction. We are now seeing some good double-blind, placebo-controlled studies and some published manuals for executive functioning coaching or training, where kids are taught to use these cognitive skills to improve especially their studies and to some extent their self-control. We don't have any studies yet on epigenetic effects of that, and the key question there, it's the same thing with medication, really going back to that, is how well do these effects persist after the intervention stops? And one of the nice things about some of these epigenetic effects is they persist after the input stops. So it might be that if you did, for example, exercise or diet, that you would correct a problem and the correction would remain. We don't know that, but it's possible. That seems to work that way in the animals. The question of the coaching and of the medication, with medication we know that when it stops, often the problems come right back, so it's not causing a permanent change. With coaching, you may get skills you can carry forward in life. So I would say there's a great deal of promise in coaching, and the trick is to get an actual proven curriculum. There are a couple of them out there now, but some coaches are doing a good job with those, and some coaches are still winging it. So I think choose your coach well, and if they're following a good curriculum, there's a good possibility it will help.
What can you recommend? What is a good coaching curriculum? I have not heard of that.
Well, there's a couple of them out. I do have them listed in the book. Now, can I get them off the top of my head or not?
That's okay. Well, we know where they are.
We know where they are. Yeah, they're in there. I have a section on coaching.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Everyone buy Dr. Nigg's book. Sounds like a great resource. Here's an interesting question. As an educator, what can we do to help a struggling child?
Oh, that's a great question. There actually is now two coaching programs for educators that are set up as curricula that are proven to be beneficial by double-blind randomized trials, and I've got those described in the book again. And if you go to the web page and ask it, I can put them up there, but off the top of my head, I can't think of them. So that you could look at those curricula that exist. The other piece is there's a lot of well-known kind of things for educators to try, but what interests me the most is some of these new curricular changes. They require some coordination between the teachers and the parents, but if you're in a position as an educator where you can set these curricula up and have the resources to do it, those look extremely promising.
Oh, that's fascinating. There are a number of adults listening in, and they're wondering if the impact of changes in diet, exercise, stress reduction, and so forth are more significant on children than they are in adults. Is there a reason to think that there's an optimistic view for adult ADHD as well as for childhood ADHD?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It seems based on developmental plasticity, it would seem likely that they're more helpful for children than adults. But on the other hand, adults have a lot more tools. Adults can do a lot of internal cognitive reframing and self-discipline and setting up their own lives in ways that are hard for children to do and hard for parents to do for their children. So adults have additional resources at their disposal. So it might be that you can get equal or greater benefits as an adult. We don't have, it's surprising how few studies of adults there are, given that in some ways
it is, isn't it? Yeah.
In some ways adults are easier to study, but we have really in some ways fewer studies of diet and exercise and everything else in adults than we do in kids. So I would say stay optimistic, and it's possible you will see equally big effects, but we just don't know for sure.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, and it is an issue of plasticity. I know from the studies on neurofeedback that they have shown higher effect on children than on adults, but I'm not sure whether that's across the board. I guess we don't know. Right. Well, everyone, this has been an unbelievably interesting webinar. Dr. Nigg, thank you so much. This is just a great sort of synthetic view of what's going on in the brain, and it makes enormous sense. And I think it's also, as you say, very optimistic for everyone to know that these positive changes are possible based on strategies that you'll articulate better in your September 20 webinar. So everyone, please go onto Dr. Nigg's website, joelniggphd.com. If you have a follow-up question, post it there. come back on September 20th at 1 p.m. where he and Dr. Nigg will talk more specifically about recommendations for sleep, diet, exercise in more detail. And again, don't forget his great new book from Guilford Press. And with that, we're going to say goodbye, and we'll see you on September 20th. Next Thursday, August 10, we'll have a webinar on classroom strategies for students with ADHD. And again, on September 20, Dr. Nigg will be back. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Nigg.
Thank you.
Bye.